Alrighty, righty, righty. That somehow feels vulgar. That's Odin there. I am not that cool to put my head on an Odin statue. Alright. Let's dig into it. This is a publication from the Apothecary called Magus. Greetings, Fashy Finn. And anyway, I really freaking like this stuff because they talk about the magic war and they talk about spirituality and they don't go overboard and they're pretty based. It's freaking nice. Well, you know, without dog whistling their balls off. So, it starts off, it says, Monas manat in se. Now, I don't really know what that means, but I can assume that the next words under it are its translation. Maybe I shouldn't assume. It says, the worst disease is spiritual. Greetings, David. And looking at liberals, I think we would deduce that to be correct. So, introduction. Many of the topics herein were introduced in the first issues of Magus. We offer some deeper comments on key points and central themes of self-initiation, tryptamines, schizophrenia, ritual, mind control, and artificial ethnogens in the context of the occult wars. This is a precursor to the brief discussion of the nature of the gods, notes on self-initiation, and finally some miscellanea of runic magic from the lore. We make no claims to any original content here. In fact, it is an attempt to revive and articulate a deep and hidden tradition. Those seeking deeper studies and allies in the great work should contact and assist in our research efforts. We thank you for supporting our mission. Absolutely, guys. Y'all's mission is my mission. Occult Wars Revised. The ancient world had a vast interconnected cultic mystery tradition that had schools and temples to teach and facilitate the initiation of the seekers into the organic light and mysteries of cosmos. These traditions split, with some seeking to use the mysteries to seize full spectrum control of the planet, while the others held to the original initiatory agenda. This is the occult war of the mystery schools. Those that escaped violent suppression often became tools of the next page of the governments which suppressed those that were deemed hostile or dangerous to the oligarchs. The others were appropriated and co-opted to condition the initiates into the cult of the state, later to be the secret societies that protect and sustain the invisible empire. Thus, at certain periods, to be a civilization was to be exclusively eligible for initiation, consisting of the magical pharmacon, automated statues, lighting and sound to occupy and focus all the senses into climaxing into a visionary pageant reinforcing the myth of the state and divine status of the rulers. If one was under the rule of the wise philosopher kings and true adepts in a heroic age, there is little to rebel against in a society of one's own people. It is only in a degenerate age, where the meaning of being a citizen or part of a people is diluted or diminished to being meaningless, that rebellion should occur. The dark cults destroyed the traditional pagan world, the groves bartering exchanged for coinage, usury, taxation, laws, wars of conquest. This becomes the template for rule by order from chaos. Extremes, traumas, and scarcity are used to fracture people's psychically in ways which use their traditions against them, such as in the conversion period when the bonds of kin and loyalty were exploited. Unilaterally, conversions to Christianity, often done by elite kings vying for position with Rome, forced the majority of the people into capitulating to avoid a civil war such as in Iceland. This is the standard tactic to create exploitable chaos. a disorientating, demoralizing, perfect storm to remove all buffers, traditional context, and group security. The ultimate rebellions in this modern age become building families, abundance, and natural skills, and returning to ancestral traditions against the cultural, technological, and monocultural death cults. The human experience and spiritual growth as unique and precious is the trophy in these spiritual wars. The nature of the world ages is entropic and not evolutionary in the traditional view, but it is cyclical, and also the domain of the individual's microcosmic alchemy to recreate and renew back to their own internal golden age. But these cultic wars are truly ancient, as are the primordial wars of the gods, and there were, constant battles and suppressions, wars and power struggles fought by occult means, influence, and actual violence. The sagas and cultic wars transformed to the heroes' quests, slaying of dragons, seeking mysteries, magical plants, and attaining initiation. The lore is clear that these cults were using many of the same herbs and occult technologies, and yet are contacting different entities or gods, or experiencing them as different through their genetic, cultural, and regional filters. Some of these gods were considered equivalents of each other, such as Odin and Mercury by the Romans, or as the Greeks and Romans share virtually the same pantheon, extending into the 9 gods of Egypt, where Mercury Hermes is understood as Thoth. Thoth equals Hermes equals Odin. Look at that. Isn't that cool? Yet this becomes abstract and subject to interpretations, filtered through genetics and culture. The function of the next page... Come on now. The function of the gods, who were associated with writing, magic, and alchemy, would partake of correspondences that blurred distinctions in the broader sense, yet they retained a specificity on the cultic and individual levels of the people. These get into the deepest levels of myth, the so-called hero or god with 1,000 faces, with each part of the pantheon in potential of being a mere aspect of one single monad, expressed in myriad ways and roles in ordering and maintaining the universe and existence. The darker gods, or entities, some interpret as shadow aspects of the gods and aspects of creation and destruction, such as the wrathful and peaceful forms of Tibetan deities, or with Odin and Loki. But at the center of the cultic wars are the possession by entities to which more and more power and knowledge is gained, but which demand darker and darker sacrifices. From a truly occult perspective, these are sentient and sapient intelligences that exist and have manifested to the elect or elite of certain peoples in certain lands. The wars of the gods entangle the humans, who are the conduits of these energies, consciously or unconsciously, and they are functionally possessed with the seemingly irrational instincts and impulses of these entities. As discussed in the first issue, the occult battles in the Old Testament between the various pagans and the demiurgic prophets can be seen in the magical duels between Moses or Aaron and the sorcerers or magicians of the Pharaoh, to the cult battles of Elijah, to the prophets of Baal. A similar dynamic can be found in the native traditions of the Bon in Tibet and the magical combat between the Buddhist wizards. These were mostly non-violent and purely magical, although later the tantric wars of Tibetan sects became violent, the current unity of Tibetan Buddhism only occurring in their solidarity against invading Red Chinese. See, nobody likes commies. In Europe, the wars, executions, and genocides broke the folk's soul, like cycles of abuse in families. This was passed on in the witch burnings and Inquisition to colonial conquests of indigenous people. Ecological destruction of the earth, indigenous people, and ecological destruction of the earth. It culminates into mass cultural suicide of the true Western civilization and Northern tradition, the sacred quest of the individual ultimately balanced in the service of his people, and therefore the greater aeonic alchemy. Aeon's an interesting choice of words there. The history of ideas and revolutions that consolidate power and wealth must be seen for what they truly are in the context of the occult wars. Many cite the counter-evolutionary statement of might is right, and yet the laboratory of nature and history prove this as false. The mutualistic or symbiotic relationships or the parasitic strategies of nature are more successful than brute force. than brute force competition. The proof of this is how the modern world is controlled by a small group of elites, who are neither strong, beautiful, nor brave. Fucking based. In most instances of history, have the masses led by physically inferior weaklings who yet exert almost superhuman authority over their subordinates. The secret societies, orders, and institutions. Portia, you need to get off my page there. The proof of this is how the modern world is controlled by a small group of elites who are neither strong, beautiful, nor brave. Most instances, history of the secret societies, orders, and institutions form concentric circles of protection for these adepts, who yield incredible full-spectrum power and authority through their minions. Simply consider the democides. What is democides? DEMOCIDES of the past century, using a few texts, symbols, and words to manufacture, convincing the farmers of one European country to kill each other in world wars. The financial sorcery of the Great Depressions to destroy the family farms, conditioning fear in Cold War paranoia to justify the buildup of nuclear weapons, and the manufactured countercultures of the 60s to create inseparable rifts in generations with artificial ethnogens and hard drugs. The list goes on. History proves that when humanity is allowed to thrive, there is high culture, art, literature, and veritable golden ages producing the initiates and true wonders of the past, the latter of which cannot be reproduced even with modern technology. Modernity. The ancient cultic centers of the organic light were systematically destroyed from a series of spiritual and physical onslaughts emanating from the same desert regions, hiding even older primordial civilizations beneath the sands. The controlled collapse of Western civilization is central to the understanding of one's own spiritual disorientation, exile from tradition and ancestral knowledge down to the ailments of body and soul. It takes a critical mass of a similar organic elite to exert a transmuting force to these anti-human agendas by building family or tribe and insulating one spiritually and eliminating as much dependency and influence as possible. The conspired control of profane psychological and spiritual warfare is manifested in the economic scarcity, the anti-human values programmed into all media and entertainment, with the weaponized use of archetypes, symbols, and exploits in the human psyche. These must be masked in goodness, sugar-coated in archetype or universal truths, or the programming would be rejected outright. The promises, or prophets, or politicians will always appeal to the masses who want certainty, ease, comfort, and assurance. In the modern world, they are the reductionist nihilists that are conspiring within the absolute vacuum of true knowledge and initiation to convince the individual they are worthless and profane in a world that is meaningless. This arises from the censoring and systematic erasure of the ancient past from burnt libraries and dying scribes. The war on our true ancient pagan traditions was the good news of the gospel, or God spell, that was cast upon our ancestors. There was no further need for spiritual striving, nor to be a hero. All were equal in sin, all capable of messianic passports to paradise. Sin was forgiven with a tax paid to an unknown God, and not a slight against one's kin that had to be remedied or atoned. Just as the promises of communism and socialism were used to destroy the old traditional world, the false egalitarian promise of a post-life paradise and Savior God appealed to the weak masses. Those that resisted were isolated, pursued, and destroyed by armies, burnt at the stake or tortured to death. The magical war on the pagan tribes went beyond crusades and inquisitions to much more subtle occult attacks. These included recasting Christ as a warrior who will fight and kill the dragon at the final battle, appropriating or destroying pagan sites, and recasting scriptures in runes, using their archetypal hold on the people to imprint this new creed magically. In the transition periods and well after, the pagan and Christian gods might both be mentioned in charms. These were mostly tolerated, but some were put to death for runic magic at quite late dates. There is much pagan lore in later Christian mythos, as Christ was mostly transmuted back to the European folk soul in the Grail myths, with the hero's ethic becoming the codes of chivalry and esoteric quests. How long we been on for? All right. We'll try not to go more than 30. So it is a potent adversary that must not be underestimated. With sophisticated techniques and a willingness to use any means available for its agenda, from occult arts or scorched earth warfare. This is why there are objections to those that dabble in the distorted Western traditions that involve these Kabbalistic Masonic rituals and language codes, as they are of the domain of these artificial entities that pretend to be the demiurge or one true God, or his angels. Within the simulation are many devils and demons, which actually reinforce the demiurgic narrative by providing its antithesis, a trap for those who attempt to rebel by seeking the given opposite. This is an important point in studying the northern traditional magic, which might invoke the gods or the Disir or Valkyries, but the magical act was ultimately of the individual. It was only after Christianity did these become truly diabolic, compacting with devils and entities that are a priori unsympathetic and outside of one's ancestral traditions. These cults emerged and took over the Roman Empire, taking the spiritual energy of the old world and recasting it as the Holy Roman Empire. All the pagan traditions were boiled down into a mixed and now demonized sludge. It must be said that there is war within the groups as they were infiltrated and subverted, such as the original European Freemasonry and even the Church itself. Lodges went to war, and some were purely hermetic and others of the Solomonic agendas, and many were aware they were being infested and controlled. Some, how do I pronounce this one? Sadovankantist? I don't know how to pronounce it. Some Sadovankantist Catholics understood that deep within the Roman traditions was an ultimately real initiatory tradition based in European esoterics. The genocides of the European people, then in the Inquisition. Yeah, I don't know what kind of Catholic that is, Fasci Finn. Sedevacantist. Sadovacantist. The genocides of the European people, then in the Inquisition, the destruction of tradition, industrial ecological destruction, and now in weaponized multiculturalism, are the sacrifices to these truly dark entities. They are worshipped in specific ways involving the magical harvesting of energy, especially children, in traditions that are so evident and cohesive and proven even in this modern world that only those that truly do not want to admit can fail to see. The harvesting is energetic in the forms of time, money, and spiritual power, all of which are the degrading mechanism to destroy individual autonomy. This is the reason why certain groups were accused of child sacrifice all over Europe, and later the fusion within the Vatican with these doctrines produced the worldwide ritual pedophilia, of which the Catholic Church is the prime. So both the mainstream and countercultures are like a two-headed beast, two mouths consuming all into the same rotting gut. Therefore one is given celebrities of these emissaries of these entities or their antithesis, who cobble together occult ambience and, by appropriating the pagan traditions, give some legitimate magical techniques, but tether them to systems and entities that feed upon them in subtle ways, like a truly evolved parasite. See, many in the occult circles take the idea that the Earth itself is an artificial planet to begin with. Nothing about this whole environment is actually our natural habitat. Obviously, that requires lots of notation needed, but as a conceptual idea, break free from everything you think you know for a moment and imagine that the world is but a dream, right? That we're actually were actually gods of some kind, and this entire experience is, in fact, a bit of drama in the universal stage. There are many such examples of the so-called adepts of the left-hand paths, whose lives of addiction and exploiting kin and friends speak volumes. Some were possessed of a certain genius, certainly had an occult power and presence, and yet fundamentally their system is especially... Oh, I can't see all of your comment, whoever that is. I'm going to have to rewatch this later. Some were possessed of a certain genius, certainly had an occult power and presence, and yet fundamentally their system is essentially beyond the invocations of some Greek gods. A non-European blend of Hebrew and Egyptian mysticism with aspects of various Eastern techniques. In studying the vast, next page, corpus of such adepts, there is no mention of the runes, beyond one allusion in a poem placing these teachings in the category of strategic disorientation. This is then somehow understood to be the Western tradition, and Europeans think that their occult systems are empowered by Hebrew or Egyptian entities over their own gods and languages. Likewise, the musicians and celebrities that revere or who follow these teachings led generations into artificial and hard drugs over plant ethnogens, Eastern, New Age, and Kabbalah over their own ancestors, promoting a rift in the generations, family, and society that was needed to destroy the individual, the family, and the culture. Red leather, yellow leather, Irish wristwatch, toy boat. The anti-tradition did not ignore the runes after they were tainted from Nazi associations after World War II, as mass-marketed occult and New Age books change and add to the runes, inserting the agendas and parasitic occult traditions in the blurring hodgepodge of modern occultism. Many supplement their true lack of self-initiation with the worst of the New Age or the worst of the hate and groupthink of those extreme only in their biophobia or contempt of life. They are seduced by the alien symbols and promises, incapable of accessing their own metagenetics and participating in their ancestral traditions in their own intimate and personal way. The ancient truisms, wisdom or universal truths, the archetypes that pervade the entire world are used to exploit the superficial similarities and hide the profoundly toxic differences between these worldviews, or are simply the tradition and counter-tradition. The revealing of low-level but genuine magical techniques, the legalization of certain sacraments, were delayed until the artificial occult psychological control infrastructure could be in place. The occult trauma-based rituals done on mass media levels using the MK Ultra-based technology to create vast feedback networks of these hive mind energies uses the majority of the society addicted to antidepressant psychotropics, opiates, or these especially targeted at children. Technology and drugs manipulating dopamine and serotonin, destroying the assimilating deep dream sleep, empathy, and connections to ancestors and nature. The dark adepts will take from various occult traditions, write books as excerpts to lore seekers, using the ritual technologies to perfect their control, and setting up occult orders that are screening and recruiting certain types of psychopathic personality, metastasizing the spiritual cancer. One cannot ignore the anti-tradition. Much in it is universal and was appropriated and these must be purged in the alchemy of one's discernment. One must study them as a doctor studies parasites or cell proliferation in toxicology, and grasp the system while retaining the native ancestral grounding of the true and noble traditions. We restate that such religions and parasitic entities are the antithesis of our native gods. Those motivations were not of their jealousy or worship, but for pragmatic reasons such as acquiring wisdom and knowledge, or transforming the world into a higher idealized existence, or defending the world against these dark monsters of the abyss. This is the essential teaching of Odin and the shamanic gods, the exaltation and intensifying of consciousness that transcends death or reabsorption into the aether. This is the secret of what Odin whispers in Baldur's ear. These other occult systems claim something about a next page. claim this as their aim. Yet they retain the umbilical-like tether as the microcosmic host for these beings. Although some vast conspiracy of secret influences is evident in even cursory glances into history, they are byproducts of the possession. This is why the artists, media, politicians, etc. all act in intergenerational cohesive agendas that never stray from this grand agenda. It begins by starving a population from information of who they are and hacking their ancestral genetic codes. Let me get my consonants correct. Genetic codes from the true evolution towards degeneration, disempowerment, demoralization, and collective suicide. The truly ancestral shaman hero's quest, the philosopher's quest to turn the base and dross into gold is the only functional option and worldview. I think I'm reaching my limit here, guys. It is the remedy, the spiritual medicine, the way of the gods and sages. Odin's lore, despite Christian distortions, maintains a shamanic identity of terrifying and dangerous initiations used to potentiate the divine strength. Ooh, this is a weird word. A with an apostrophe over it, or no, what was I called? An accent. A accent S Megin. Asmegin. I don't know what that is. His moral paradoxes are reconciled in noble strategies to forestall or minimize threatening future events, but there is no pretense about the dark sides and shadow aspects that make him dangerous and wild. Odin is anxious and foreboding and seeking wisdom, aware of his limitations, and threats to the innocence of Balder and the fragility of existence. There is no false claim at omniscience or omnipotence that renders everything scripted and thus sadomasochistic. The organic mythos of a man who becomes a god through initiation and heroic effort is the northern tradition versus Abrahamic slaves of a god who becomes a man to save them through no effort or action of their own, born in sin, condemned to hell, ultimately devoid of free will or the ability to grow, evolve, and know oneself. Lest we be accused of some prejudicial attacks of old conspiracy theories and racial canards, we view the spiritually infected peoples of the deserts as the original victims, enslaved by these myths, gods, and meteorites. Meteorites? What in the world? Okay, then. The episode of the golden calf has the people returning to the pagan gods, and they were slaughtered by one tribe who later became the priests of this cult. Exodus 32. The heirs to this victim-savior programming are all those who are begging for a leader or government or entity to effect their salvation or fix their problems. The identitarian hive-mind logic was born of the lie of the chosen people, much as the ritual abusers use such tactics to intoxicate their prey with feelings of being special. Such spiritual abuse is rampant as the broken seeker settles for validation, narratives, and crutches instead of the brutal self-work of real transformation. Those that grasp the psychological archetypes can truly exploit those answers in a world perceived as meaningless. The same tactics give them a death and rebirth, but into a deeper snare. The Hyperborean path is of self-initiation, emulating the All-Father's shamanic model and discovering the true nature of the runic mysteries, sacrificial quests, and sacramental meads. The one is an ingestive initiatory worldview where mysteries are experienced for growth, co-creation, and evolution of life and reality, while the other is a static world in full control of a psychopath god. All is preordained and cast to extremes of hell or heaven through the whims of a pretending tyrant. The Indo-European gods are engaged in reality in a dynamic way, growing and learning. Your professional qualities. Oh, thank you. Where am I? I lost my spot. Oh, god damn it. The one is an investigator. The Indo-European gods are engaged in reality in a dynamic way, growing and learning, becoming through suffering, engaging in an ongoing process of creation and self-work, of becoming free of whatever is on the next page, becoming free of the neurosis born from the parasite, There is a lack of vanity and hubris in the true shamanic gods, who are engaged in the serious introspective work of self-knowledge and mystical exploration of the collective potentials, and are not obsessed and jealous, creating beings who merely worship and fear them. They are honored, feared, and worshipped from the people of their own volition, not out of the threats of eternal damnation. The parasitic demiurgic gods are patient entities, preparing the slaves over generations, over thousands of years, laying foundations in the subconscious for externalizing the origins of the parasitic mysteries as the final show of power. The trauma-based rituals, like the major staged psychological operations, are designed to fracture the consciousness and return the mind to an infantile state, keeping the people in spiritual and economic debt that is paid with their actual life energy. Of course, the primordial debt is being born in original sin. The wages of sin are death and eternal hell without the Savior and the fatalist nightmares of anti-human worldviews. The great work is the reintegration of the schizophrenic bipolarity conditioning the microcosmic potential living hell of mortal existence, which is the solve et coagula of the organic diamond mind singularity. The ancestors could become deified through heroic actions or deals through the alchemical path of the sages or mystery initiations, which is the ultimate work of the Magus. And that is about the first quarter of this little book, because it's an itty-bitty book. And we are at about half an hour. So the three people who are here are cooler than everyone else because I said so. And I will see y'all probably over at the stream that I saw Fantasy Finn on just now. And 1488 Hail our people, may Odin's blessings be upon you all.